Is this father's suspicion of his daughter's boyfriend justified? Or is he just being overprotective? I don't like my daughter's boyfriend. It's not that I want to control her choices, or that I'm oblivious to the fact that she's grown up. But every time I look at him, every time I watch him smile at her or touch her hand, something deep inside me clenches. A primal and unrelenting instinct that tells me something is wrong. It gnaws at my insides. This feeling, and no matter how much I try to shake it off, it lingers. From the moment I first met him, I knew there was something off. He had a certain charm. I won't deny that. A confident smile, an easy laugh. He had that practiced politeness that so many young men have learned to wield like a shield. But beneath it, I could sense an undercurrent of something I didn't like. My daughter, Grace, seemed smitten. Her eyes sparkled when she looked at him, and her laughter became lighter, freer, as if she floated when he was near. But to me, there was always a shadow that followed him, a darkness that I could not name. My wife, Marianne, tried to tell me that I was being overprotective. He's just young, she said, brushing off my concerns. They're young, and you need to let them be. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think that my misgivings were nothing more than an overreaction. But every instinct in my body told me otherwise. Marianne's reassurances could not quiet the unease that built up in me every time that boy set foot in our house. He had a way of speaking that seemed rehearsed, like he was always putting on a show. The words would roll off his tongue too smoothly, each one a carefully chosen part of his performance. Grace would sit next to him on the couch, her head resting on his shoulder, and he would tell stories, some funny, others slightly tragic, that seemed almost too perfect. He would mention places he'd been, adventures he had, and I would watch my daughter's eyes widen with admiration. He'd glance at me now and then, just a flicker of his gaze, and I could see the calculation in his eyes. A quick assessment, as if he was trying to read me, gauge my reactions. I didn't like that. I didn't like that he was aware of my watching him. It made me feel like I was part of some game I didn't fully understand. Like there was a playbook that only he knew. My discomfort only grew as the months went on. He seemed to always be around. Every time I came home from work, I'd hear his voice before I even opened the front door. He was in my house more often than I was, and the sight of him sitting at my kitchen table, drinking coffee from my mug, grated on me. He was comfortable in a way that seemed almost invasive, like he was laying claim to something that was mine. I started to notice things, little things, that seemed off. He'd laugh at jokes that weren't funny. He'd make comments that, on the surface, sounded like compliments, but underneath had a sharpness to them. He'd talk about Grace's friends in a way that felt condescending, like he was amused by them rather than genuinely interested. He was always just a little too quick to dismiss her opinions, a little too eager to correct her. And the worst part was that Grace seemed blind to it all. She smiled and laughed and looked at him like he was everything she'd ever wanted. I wanted to talk to her about it, to sit her down and tell her that she deserved better, that I could see something in him that she couldn't. But I knew how that would go. She would tell me that I was being unfair, that I didn't understand him. She'd tell me that I was overreacting, just like Marianne had, and maybe she'd be right. Maybe I was seeing something that wasn't there, projecting my fears onto this young man simply because I didn't want to let go of my daughter. But then there were the moments when I caught the look in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. A coldness, an emptiness that slipped through the mask. It was fleeting, but it was there, and it made my blood run cold. I'd watch him as he watched Grace, and I'd feel a sense of dread settle in my stomach. Heavy and unmoving. There were times when I'd hear them arguing, their voices muffled through the walls of her room. I couldn't make out the words, but I could hear the tone. Grace's voice would be sharp, edged with frustration, while his remained steady, calm, almost taunting. And then the door would open, and they'd emerge, Grace with her eyes red-rimmed, her smile forced. He'd have his arm around her shoulders, his face a mask of concern, and he'd meet my eyes with that same unreadable look. I wanted to grab him by the collar, drag him out of my house, and tell him never to come back, but I knew that would only push Grace further into his arms. One night, I came home late from work. The house was dark, and I assumed everyone had gone to bed. I was tired, bone-weary from a long day, and all I wanted was to sit down, have a drink, and let the silence of the house wash over me. But as I stepped into the living room, I heard a noise, a low, muffled sobbing. My heart sank, and I followed the sound to the kitchen. There, in the dim light from the hallway, I saw Grace sitting at the table, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent cries. I stood there for a moment, frozen, not knowing what to do. She looked so small, so vulnerable, and my heart broke for her. I wanted to go to her, to wrap my arms around her and tell her everything would be okay. But before I could move, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, and there he was, standing in the doorway, his face obscured by the shadows. He looked at Grace, then at me, and there was something in his eyes, something dark and triumphant. He didn't say a word, just walked past me, his shoulder brushing against mine as he went to Grace. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears, and he knelt beside her, his voice soft and soothing as he spoke words I couldn't hear. She nodded, wiping her eyes, and I watched as she leaned into him, her sobs quieting. He looked up at me then, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips, and I felt a surge of anger so intense it almost knocked me off my feet. I knew, in that moment, that I could not stand by and do nothing. I could not let this boy, this manipulative, deceitful boy, take my daughter away from me. I had to do something, anything, to protect her, but I also knew that if I acted rashly, if I confronted him head-on, I would lose her. He had her wrapped around his finger, and if I pushed too hard, she would only fall deeper under his spell. So I waited, I watched, I bided my time, hoping that Grace would see him for who he truly was. I tried to be there for her, to show her that she didn't need him, that she was strong enough on her own. I took her out for breakfast on Sundays, just the two of us, like we used to before he came into the picture. I listened when she talked about her day, her hopes, her dreams. I tried to remind her of who she was, of the person she had been before he came along. And then, one day, it happened. I came home to find Grace sitting on the front steps, her face pale, her eyes hollow. She looked up at me, and I could see the pain etched into her features, the realization that had finally dawned. She didn't say anything, just stood up and walked into my arms, her body trembling as she held onto me. I didn't ask her what had happened, didn't press her for details. I just held her, feeling the weight of her heartbreak, the heaviness of the truth she had finally seen. It wasn't easy. The weeks that followed, she was broken, shattered by the realization of who he truly was, of how he had manipulated her, twisted her love into something dark and ugly. She cried a lot, her sobs echoing through the house in the dead of night, and there was nothing I could do but be there, to hold her when she needed it, to give her space when she didn't. Marianne and I did our best to support her, to help her piece herself back together, one fragile shard at a time. There were moments when I saw him, lurking at the edge of our lives, trying to worm his way back in. He'd call, leave messages on her phone, and I could see the struggle in her eyes, the pull of the love she had once felt for him. But she stayed strong, stronger than I ever thought she could be. She blocked his number, deleted his messages, and slowly, she began to heal. I don't know if she will ever be the same, if she will ever fully recover from what he did to her. But I do know that she is stronger now, that she has seen the darkness that can hide behind a charming smile, and that she will never let herself be fooled again. And as much as it hurt to watch her go through that pain, I am proud of her, proud of the strength she found within herself, proud of the woman she is becoming. I still don't like her boyfriend, but now, I can finally see my daughter for who she truly is, not the little girl I wanted to protect, but a strong, resilient young woman who can face the world on her own terms. And that, more than anything, is what matters.